Good morning, everybody. It's great to see you. Today we're going to be looking at the story of Israel from the phase after Nick shared with us at the all-age service. So if you remember, he talked about that initial sending out of the spies and the fear Israel had in trusting God. And what did that result in? It resulted in them wandering in the desert for 40 years. While they were there, what did they see? They saw God lead them. And again, Simon touched on that when he was talking about the presence of God, when he spoke after that. He talked about how God led them in that time, how he was a cloud or a pillar of fire, and then when he landed on the tabernacle, they knew he was there. In that time, they still had to learn how to trust God and humble themselves. You have accounts through Exodus of them having provision from God through manna and quail that would only last a day, but that didn't stop them from trying to take a little bit more because they thought they could have a little bit more, and lo and behold, it would be mouldy and disgusting the following day. They had to learn in that 40 years how to humble themselves before God and trust in him. Trust his plan, trust in his provision, and recognize that he was for them and that he loved them. And if they loved him with all their heart, mind and strength, he would lead them and provide for them. And it's from here that we're going to read. We're going to read from Deuteronomy 8, if anyone wants to follow along. And we're going to be reading from the beginning of the chapter through to verse 18. This is Moses speaking. Be careful to follow every command I am giving you today, so that you may live and increase and may enter and possess the land the Lord promised you on oath to your ancestors. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothes did not wear out, and your feet did not swell during these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciples his son, so the Lord your God disciplines his son. So the Lord your God disciplines you. Observe the commands of the Lord your God, walking in obedience to him and revering him. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks and streams and deep springs gushing out into the valley and hills, a land with wheat and barley, vines and fig trees, pomegranates, olive oil and honey, a land where bread will not be scarce and you will lack nothing, a land where the rocks are iron and you can dig copper out of the hills. When you've eaten and are satisfied, praise the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord your God, failing to observe his commands, his laws and his decrees that I am giving you this day. Otherwise, when you eat and are satisfied, when you build fine houses and settle down, and when your herds and flocks grow large, and your silver and gold increase, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart will become proud, and you will forget the Lord your God, who has brought you out of Egypt and out of the land of slavery. He led you through the vast and dreadful wilderness, that thirsty and waterless land with its venomous snakes and scorpions. He brought you water out of the hard rock. He gave you manna to eat in the wilderness, something your ancestors had never known, to humble and test you, so that in the end it might go well with you. You may say to yourself, my power and strength of my hands have produced this wealth for me. But remember that the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors, as it is today. Moses was reminding them all that God had done through the desert. He'd done so to prepare them for the next part of the plan. So what can we learn from this? Here are a few things that I think God is saying to us as we step across the Jordan, because that's what they were doing, and we're stepping into a new year with new plans and purposes, and we're seeking God's presence as we do so. But I think there's a few things that we can learn from that. Firstly, in verses 2 to 5, it says, remember how the Lord your God led you. Do we remember all that God has provided for us in Jesus? Do we remember all that God provides for us on a daily basis? Do we recognize that when Jesus said, I am the bread of life, whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty? Do we actually recognize that he's the provider of our food? Or is there a little bit of us that goes into the mode of, well, I've worked hard, I've earned the money, I provide those things for myself? In verse 7 and 9, it goes on to talk about the good land, the things and the abundance that comes from that. Do we remember that God will lead us and provide for the plans he has for us? Moses reminded them of that promise that the land would hold, its beauty, its abundance, its wealth. Jesus reminded us that the future was heaven, with our Heavenly Father, with all its beauty and abundance. But his plan for us is to live in the present in that security, to remember that we are his ambassadors, and through him we get to show others what heaven is like as we bring the kingdom to here. I thought I smiled as soon as you spoke, Steve, because it just really reinforced that challenge of recognizing that we are here to bring heaven to earth. We are here to show people what the kingdom of God is like. And actually that's our challenge, just as Steve said, is to show that through all the things that we do. In verses 10 to 18, remember that God is our provider, not ourselves. When blessing comes, Moses reminds them that we recognize who it's come from. As I said earlier, the challenge we have of recognizing what we get is what we've been given, not what we've earned. And that mindset of how we view our time and money is that they are both things that God has given us. It's so easy to look at our lives and take pride in our achievements. But the second we do, we put ourselves above God, because we're thinking about us, aren't we? We're talking about the self. Rather, it should be, we need to recognize what God has given us, and how our worship, how our daily lives are a way of us showing what God has given us. And I get challenged by this a lot, because I have to keep step and challenge myself in that what I'm trying to do is not a hunger from within me, but it's a hunger that God has given me. And just to give you an example, in the last couple of months, I know you know the story of the way that God has just been blessing the community supermarket, but the opportunity to be part of that was a complete privilege that I am now part of, but not just here. Steve at the church weekend had this word for me that he didn't want to give, and at that time I'd been made redundant, and I trusted God, but I couldn't see how it was going to happen. And he said, I can't go up to Pete, but if Pete comes up to me, I'm gonna share it. And lo and behold, I walked up to him and gave him a hug, and he shared this picture that God has said it was that whatever was going to happen with me was going to be unconventional. It was not going to be a standard 9-to-5 job. And to an extent, Cindy had also spoken into that a little bit prior to that, when she knew that I was being made redundant. And she'd spoken to me and said that, God's got something for you, and it's much bigger than you think. So these two words had been there, and the weekend of the church weekend, I had to make a decision about applying for a job to do with another community supermarket. Well, I got that job, and all of a sudden I was doing a little bit of respite for a couple of weeks. We had a little boy that you might have seen attached to me for about 10 days, and I started that role, and then we started preparing for the community supermarket. So all of a sudden there were like 2 or 3 different things happen. Well, since then, the role that I've been doing in Malden with the community supermarket has, every time I seem to have a conversation with somebody, it grows. And all of a sudden, we're now leading in a community supermarket in Braintree as well. So now that's 3 community supermarkets. I have a conversation with somebody in Malden District Council 2 weeks ago to do with how these are going to be sustainable, these community supermarkets, because they need to get the price of the items down as low as possible. And guess what? The only way you can do that is in bulk. And you need the space to have that in bulk. Within 3 days, it had gone out to every single chief exec across the county, who are then now putting money towards, trying to put money towards setting up a central location. And all of them, they go, oh, Pete's the person leading on this. And I'm going, what? God, when you step out into God's plans and you trust him, he provides in abundance. A simple thing that happened, Kerry and I, we'd started, and Kerry was looking for ways that we could get those items and get local produce. And she found this charity called Big Barn. Now, Big Barn is a charity where they're trying to get local producers to come together to find a way of selling their produce and get more money than the supermarkets are asking for them. And he gave an example of them providing, he had onions that he was growing in Norfolk. He sold them for £100 a tonne to a packer who packed them and sold them to Tesco's for £400 a tonne. Okay? Who then sold them at £800 a tonne. And he was going, why can't we get them for more? Because that is ridiculous. Well, anyway, as we were having this conversation with him, Kerry and I were both looking at each other virtually because it was on a screen. And I just whispered and went, this is much bigger than us. And because we are linked to something called Feeding Britain, which is a network for all affordable food clubs and community supermarkets, I just said to Kerry, I'm going to pass the details on. Well, now I passed the details on. His details have been passed to a national wholesaler for all of the community supermarkets and affordable food clubs. And he's now being able to support and bless thousands of people with his produce. Because something small was given and it's become bigger. We have a challenge of making sure that what we do is in step with God, don't we? We have a challenge of recognizing, just like Moses did there, that there is something in us that can be selfish, that can do those things. But when we choose to step out of that, when we choose to recognize who is giving us the opportunities in the first place and point to him as we do it, he blesses. We need to remember that God is doing that in us day by day. We need to remember that he's going to provide. He's going to provide our daily bread. I quite like the fact, I know some of you won't like this, I quite like the fact that while they were in the desert, none of their clothes wore out. I know for some people here, the idea of getting new clothes might be more appealing, but the fact that for 40 years, no one had to go and buy any clothes or do anything else, other than the fact that maybe some of the kids grew, so they needed, swap them round, but none of their clothes wore out. I quite like the fact that for 40 years they walked and they didn't get sore feet. I thought that's quite cool as well. But God enabled it to happen. They had to walk a journey and God enabled it to happen. Do we recognize that God is taking us somewhere and he's not going to let us wear out? He's not going to let our feet get weary. When we focus on him, that's what happens. We've got a number of things that God, we feel as a church, God is leading us into. This building has become a resource that we've given to him and he is using. And I think part of that coming into his presence and focusing ourselves on that is the same as what happened here. Moses was giving them his last almost epitaph, really, wasn't it? He was saying, this is what you need to hold on to. And after this, he then shared the commandments, all 613 commandments, in order to help them keep their focus in the right place. When we look at what Jesus responded to in the New Testament, we have how the legislation of those commandments, not the heart of those commandments, had been focused on. We see in the Pharisees how following the rules was more important than following the person that had given those rules. It's why Jesus challenged them a number of times. Challenged them about when they would say, why haven't your disciples washed their hands? And he would go, no, it's not about the washing of hands. It's about the purity of your heart and what comes out of your mouth as a response to that. It's about not being concerned about what you look like on the outside to everybody else. You know, the fact that he identified them almost as graves that have been whitewashed. On the outside they looked bright and brilliant, but on the inside they were dead. And those are the challenges that we face day by day if we take our eyes off Jesus. We have this challenge of recognizing that when we put ourselves first, that's what we do. And I know I mentioned at the very beginning about how we look at our week, but that is a very small way that the devil can just put ideas into our head about what our priorities are. If God's at the beginning of our week, if that's where we rest on a Sunday and we come together and we draw closer to him, it's our sustenance for the rest of the week. If we look at our week as if we earn our weekends because we work Monday to Friday, yeah, it's the weekend, it's ours, we've changed that shift. I'm not saying that it's wrong to enjoy the weekend coming and not working, but actually it's that slight shift in our mentality that takes us off God and more about self, because suddenly it becomes how we use our time, not recognize how God has given us time to use. He's also given us a Sunday to rest, because you know what? We can get incredibly busy. And I have a challenge that now that I'm doing things unconventionally, it's keeping all the balls up in the air, isn't it? But actually, if I put God first, he will keep them up there. How we use our time, how we look at our time, how we look at the money that we get, how we look at the opportunities we have to bring heaven to earth through the way that we display what it means to be part of God's kingdom. Not just to the people in this room, to our friends, but to the people that we come into contact with. Yesterday, Nikki had asked the girls and I to go and help with a school that she is supporting at the moment. So we spent the day rubbing down walls, repainting hallways. I did that for 3 or 4 hours and then built a shed for 3 or 4 hours, because they needed someone to love them. Now, I didn't do it on purpose, but I just put a t-shirt on, and some of you might have seen that I've got the Chosen shirt. It's got, so it's got the little fishes going around and then a few going the opposite direction. And I started talking to just a guy that was there as well, who's somebody else that had come along and helped. Turns out they're Christians. I said that to Nikki. She went, I've been working with her for 3 months and I've not picked up that yet, because it's very much keeping work. So we were talking to them. I was talking to them and talking about, how being able to do that. We go into a stop and we were having something to eat at lunchtime, and someone goes, "Oh, did you watch The Chosen?" And it was Asenko. Turns out she's a Christian. And just suddenly, you saw the people that were there coming to want to bless, coming to want to give their time to something that they knew was bigger than themselves. What's God calling you to do? How is God calling you to use your time? How are we displaying what's on the inside that God is working on as we speak? What's coming out of our mouths? What's coming out in our actions? Because I know that I try to get it right, but I also know I get it wrong sometimes as well. And unfortunately, sometimes it's when I'm tired that the people closest to me, like my kids, get it. So how can I be more like Jesus to them? But how as a church can we do that for our community? God had a plan for Israel. After this had happened, after all the law had been given, after Moses had died, Joshua took over. And this time, when they looked at the promised land, they didn't see the fear. They saw what God had promised them. When they stepped over the Jordan, when the tabernacle and the Holy of Holies went before them so that they could then cross, they grabbed stones, one for each tribe, from the riverbed. And they put them there as a remembering what God had done in the desert. What God had done to get them to this point. Sorry, not holding it close enough. And from there, they trusted God. They trusted God when he did things in very unconventional ways. You know, as a military leader, going to the first place that you're going to attack and going around worshipping around the walls wouldn't have been my first choice as a military leader. But they trusted God. They trusted in his plan. And he gave them that place. What is God calling us to do? What is God challenging us to do as a community? How are you part of it?